The evening was charged long before the two men even entered the stage. People had gathered with a sense of curiosity, knowing that whenever Barack Obama and Donald Trump were in the same room, something memorable was bound to unfold. The chatter in the hall grew louder with every passing minute. Reporters whispered predictions, and cameras were fixed tightly on the podium, waiting for a moment worth capturing. Trump, with his usual confidence, carried himself as though the spotlight belonged to him. He knew how to command attention, how to fill a room with his voice and presence, and tonight was no exception. As he began to speak, he didn't waste time on pleasantries or light humor. Instead, he set his eyes directly on Obama, and with a smirk that suggested he was ready to provoke, he delivered his words like a calculated strike. The insult came, in a style that only Trump could deliver, part blunt, part mocking, yet carefully crafted to draw out a reaction. He questioned Obama's legacy, framed his leadership as weak, and ridiculed his decisions in a way that left no doubt the words were meant to cut deep. He went further than policy. He made it personal. There was a noticeable shift in the crowd as people processed the remark. Some gasped softly, others chuckled uncomfortably, and many simply sat still, eyes darting between the two men as though waiting for a storm to break. The insult was not the kind that could be brushed aside as casual banter. It was a deliberate attempt to belittle, to reduce the stature of a man who had once stood as the most powerful leader in the world. Obama, seated calmly, didn't flinch when the words landed. His face remained composed, his posture relaxed, but his silence was louder than any immediate retort could have been. That was always part of his presence. He never seemed rattled, even when targeted directly. Yet the people around him were not so calm. Advisors shifted uneasily in their seats. Allies clenched their jaws, and even members of the audience who leaned toward Trump seemed to brace themselves, curious to see if the former president would finally be pushed into anger. The room had tilted toward Trump's advantage for the moment, because the insult was sharp, the timing was precise, and the audience had been caught off guard. But that tilt wasn't complete. Obama's history with criticism had always shown a different pattern. He absorbed it, processed it, and then responded with precision, never rushing, never allowing his opponent to dictate the tempo. In that moment, Trump had thrown the first heavy punch. But what mattered wasn't the insult itself, it was how Obama would choose to answer it. And that was exactly why the room grew even more tense after the words were spoken. Everyone had seen Trump insult countless figures before, but very few had watched Barack Obama become the direct target in such a raw, unfiltered way. The anticipation that followed was almost heavier than the insult itself. Trump, sensing he had drawn blood, continued with his point, his tone dripping with confidence. He glanced at Obama occasionally, waiting for a reaction, ready to double down if he saw any flicker of discomfort. But Obama gave him nothing, no raised eyebrow, no tightened jaw, no shifting in his seat. He understood the power of restraint. He knew that by holding still, by letting the words linger in the air without immediately firing back, he was controlling the next move without saying a single thing. The insult was meant to diminish him, to turn the audience's eyes toward Trump as the victor of that exchange. But even as the words echoed, the room began to feel the weight of Obama's silence. Some members of the crowd who had chuckled at Trump's jab now sat quietly, wondering what was coming. Others leaned in closer, aware that Obama's reply, whenever it came, would not be loud or frantic, but carefully measured. Trump had drawn the first line, but everyone knew Obama had a way of finishing moments, not just surviving them. The insult, in its sharp delivery, created the opening scene of a confrontation that would soon take a very different turn. Would you like me to now expand keynote 2, in the same storytelling style, also around 700 words? The pause was not accidental. Barack Obama had always understood the power of silence, the way it could disarm a room more effectively than a rushed defense. After Trump's words, all eyes turned to him, expecting a sharp rebuttal, a clash of voices that would ignite the evening. Instead, he remained still, hands folded lightly, his gaze steady but unprovoked. That stillness carried its own weight. The crowd didn't know what to do with it. A moment of silence in a setting so loud and politically charged felt unnatural, even uncomfortable, yet it pulled everyone closer to him without him lifting a finger. The reporters waiting to scribble down quotes suddenly hesitated, unsure if the silence itself might be the story. Trump, on the other hand, was not a man who enjoyed quiet. He thrived on immediate reactions, on the energy of applause, boos, or outrage. To him, silence felt like resistance. He shifted slightly at the podium, glancing at Obama again, as though trying to read whether his insult had landed properly. But Obama gave no indication of bruised pride or irritation. He leaned back slightly in his chair, lips forming the faintest smile, not wide enough to be mocking, but just enough to show composure. That pause began to stretch into something more. Seconds ticked by, and the audience, unsure of how long he would remain quiet, started to grow restless. The pause was not just silence anymore, it was anticipation. People leaned forward in their seats, eager to catch the first words he would speak. Every second he remained quiet made the eventual response feel heavier, as if it would carry twice the force once released. This was a skill that had followed him from the campaign trail to the White House, knowing that words said too soon often dissolved, but words delivered at the perfect time could echo far beyond the room. Obama's calm demeanor contrasted sharply with Trump's fiery energy. The two men embodied entirely different approaches to confrontation, one aggressive and immediate, the other deliberate and patient. That contrast made the silence even more striking. Obama wasn't just waiting, he was reshaping the rhythm of the exchange. The insult that had seemed so sharp moments earlier now lingered in the air like a balloon losing air, and the longer he remained silent, the less powerful it seemed. For those who had watched him throughout his career. The pause was familiar. He had used it in debates when opponents tried to overwhelm him with rapid-fire criticism. He had used it in speeches, letting words breathe before delivering the next phrase, ensuring the audience had time to absorb. He knew that silence wasn't absence, it was strategy. In this moment, he was letting Trump's words hang unchallenged, just long enough to expose their hollowness. Some members of the audience began whispering, their voices cutting into the quiet. A reporter scribbled furiously, already preparing to frame this as a moment of unusual restraint. Trump, sensing that his jab had not landed as strongly as he intended, tried to move on, adding another comment, but even that lacked the same punch. It was as if Obama's silence had taken control of the tempo, slowing everything down, forcing everyone to wait for him. Finally, Obama lifted his chin slightly, signaling that he was about to speak. The room, once restless, fell back into full silence, but this time, it was purposeful. Every camera tilted his way, every pen hovered above the page, every person in the audience held their breath. Trump himself went quiet, as though aware that the moment had already shifted. Obama had taken the energy out of the insult, replaced it with his own pace, and now held the room firmly in his grasp. The pause had done its work. It had magnified whatever he was about to say, and the power of his response would come not just from the words themselves, but from the weight of the silence that preceded them. Do you want me to continue with Keynote 3 expanded in 700 words in the same calm storytelling style? When Barack Obama finally chose to speak, it wasn't with a raised voice or a defensive tone. He didn't match Trump's intensity or attempt to overpower him. Instead, he leaned forward slightly, his voice calm, steady, and perfectly measured. He looked directly at Trump, then at the crowd, and delivered a single sentence that seemed almost effortless. It wasn't long or complicated. It wasn't packed with policy details or heavy rhetoric. It was short, sharp, and perfectly chosen. In that one moment, the balance of the room shifted entirely. The sentence carried a weight that no insult could match. It wasn't aggressive, but it carried authority. It wasn't mocking, yet it cut through Trump's bravado with surgical precision. The brilliance of it was in its simplicity. Where Trump had used a string of words to make his insult land, Obama needed only one calm line to unravel it completely. The effect was instant. The crowd, which had been holding its breath in anticipation, erupted. Some laughed in disbelief. Others clapped, and many simply shook their heads at how quickly the atmosphere had turned. The tension that had been building since Trump's jab suddenly released, and it was Obama who had control of the room now. Trump's reaction told its own story. He shifted at the podium, his expression flickering for the briefest second as though he hadn't expected that kind of response. He was a man used to trading blows, used to loud exchanges where whoever shouted the loudest appeared to win. But Obama hadn't played by those rules. He hadn't given him the fight he wanted. Instead, he had taken the air out of the insult with a single line, leaving no room for escalation. It was the type of reply that didn't just silence an opponent in the moment, but lingered, replayed in people's minds long after the words were spoken. The audience's reaction only deepened the effect. Some who had laughed at Trump's insult earlier now found themselves clapping for Obama's composure. The shift in mood was undeniable. What had started as Trump's advantage had been completely reversed. Even those who weren't supporters of Obama could recognize the skill in what had just happened. It wasn't about partisanship, it was about mastery of the moment. Obama didn't continue with a speech or try to explain himself. That was the genius of it. He knew that adding more words would dilute the power of the sentence, so he leaned back. Once again, letting the applause and murmurs of the crowd wash over the room. His restraint gave the impression of someone who didn't need to win with volume because he had already won with precision. The more he stayed silent after his sentence, the more it reinforced that he had said exactly enough. For years, people had spoken of Obama's ability to remain unshaken under pressure, but seeing it in contrast to Trump's aggressive style made it clearer than ever. Where one thrived on confrontation, the other thrived on timing. This wasn't just about clever words, it was about the control of energy, the ability to guide a crowd's focus without forcing it. Trump had thrown the first strike, but Obama had delivered the line that people would remember. Even the reporters who had been scribbling frantically moments before seemed to pause, some lowering their pens as though stunned by the simplicity of what they had witnessed. Cameras captured the reaction on faces throughout the hall: surprise, admiration, even a touch of disbelief. It wasn't just a comeback. It was a lesson in how power could be displayed without aggression. Obama had shown that sometimes the sharpest answer is the one that doesn't raise its voice, but instead lands quietly and decisively, leaving no room for rebuttal. Asterisk. By the time the noise in the room settled, there was no question about what had just happened. Trump had fired the insult, but Obama had delivered the line that changed everything. It was a moment that would be replayed on television, dissected in articles, and shared in conversations, each retelling strengthening the impact of that one calm sentence. Obama had proven once again that true strength often lies not in how loudly you speak, but in knowing exactly what to say and when to say it. Would you like me to go ahead and expand Keynote 4 in the same 700-word storytelling style? The aftermath of Obama's response unfolded almost like a ripple effect. The sentence he had delivered was still hanging in the air, replaying itself in people's minds. When the audience erupted with laughter, applause, and murmurs of disbelief, the energy in the room had shifted so quickly that it was almost dizzying. Only moments earlier, Trump had seemed to control the stage with his sharp jab, but now the spotlight had swung firmly to Obama. The contrast between the insult and the reply was so stark that it felt as though the entire event had been rewritten in an instant. Asterisk. Obama didn't move to capitalize on the moment with a lengthy speech. He didn't pound the table or call for more attention. Instead, he leaned back in his chair, letting the noise of the crowd fill the space. His calm demeanor after dropping the line was as important as the line itself. It showed he didn't need to fight for dominance, he already had it. That quiet confidence was contagious. Even those who weren't supporters of his couldn't help but respect the way he had turned the tables. Asterisk. Trump, for his part, tried to recover. He shifted back to his notes, spoke louder, and attempted to redirect the audience to his original point. But the room was no longer listening in the same way. His words didn't carry the same punch they had before. Each attempt to regain control seemed smaller compared to the sentence that had already stolen the night. Obama hadn't just neutralized the insult, he had flipped it, leaving Trump to navigate the awkward position of talking. Through a crowd still buzzing from the comeback, asterisk, the audience's reaction deepened as the moments passed. Some were still, chuckling, others leaned toward their neighbors to whisper about what had just happened, and a few simply shook their heads in disbelief at how swiftly the balance had turned. Cameras zoomed in on faces, capturing smiles, raised eyebrows, and nods of agreement. The image of Obama sitting calmly while the crowd reacted around him would later become one of the most replayed clips from the event. Asterisk. Reporters were already drafting their headlines. They knew the story wasn't going to be Trump's insult but Obama's reply. The one sentence would be quoted, analyzed, and replayed across every major outlet. It had all the qualities of a defining political moment: brevity, wit, and the ability to shift public perception in seconds. For Trump, the insult had been a move to establish dominance, but for Obama, the response had been a masterclass in timing. The aftermath proved that the audience valued restraint, paired with precision, over volume, paired with aggression. Asterisk. What stood out most was how easily Obama seemed to let the crowd take ownership of the moment. He didn't force applause, it came naturally. He didn't demand laughter, it erupted on its own. He didn't push the audience into choosing sides, they instinctively leaned toward him. It was the kind of control that couldn't be had to be earned in real time, in front of people who had seen both men operate at their highest levels. Asterisk. Trump tried to push forward, adding more energy to his words, but the silence that had once worked against Obama now seemed to work against him. Every sentence Trump delivered seemed to land in the shadow of the one Obama had spoken. The crowd's attention was no longer with him in the same way, and that loss of energy was impossible to disguise. Obama didn't need to say another word to reinforce the point. The audience was doing it for him with every clap, every laugh, and every glance in his direction. Asterisk. As the event continued, the air never quite returned to where it had been before. People were still replaying the line in their heads, still thinking about how easily it had turned an insult into an opportunity. By the time the evening ended, the consensus was clear. Trump had fired the first shot, but Obama had owned the moment, and the fact that he had done it with just one sentence made it even more remarkable. Asterisk. The aftermath stretched beyond the room itself. Within minutes, clips were circulating online, reactions were flooding social media, and commentators were already calling it a defining exchange. The sentence had outlived the insult, and in politics, that was the true measure of victory. Obama had not only shifted the mood in the room, but left behind a moment that people would revisit long after the night was over. Do you want me to now craft the ending statements in 500 words to bring the entire story full circle? In the end, what lingered most about that night was not the insult that had been thrown, but the way it was answered. Donald Trump had delivered his words with the intention of leaving a mark, but Barack Obama had shown that true strength comes not from matching aggression with aggression, but from choosing restraint, timing, and clarity. His one sentence didn't just serve as a response, it became the defining moment, overshadowing everything that had been said before and after. Asterisk. People left the event still talking about it, shaking their heads at how easily the entire room had been turned around. Some marveled at the wit of the sentence itself, while others admired the composure that had allowed him to wait, to pause, and to strike at the exact right moment. It reminded many of why Obama had earned a reputation as one of the most effective communicators of his generation. He didn't overwhelm with words. He allowed the right ones to carry all the power they needed. Asterisk for Trump, the moment underscored the limits of his style. His sharp, direct approach had worked in countless other arenas, but against someone who refused to be rushed or provoked, it faltered. The louder he tried to push forward after the exchange, the more it highlighted the contrast between them. The audience wasn't captivated by volume anymore, they were captivated by precision, and once that shift happened, there was no reclaiming. The aftermath was swift and unforgiving. Clips of the exchange spread across social media, and headlines framed it as Obama outmaneuvering Trump with a single line. Commentators dissected the exchange, not to discuss the substance of the insult, but to highlight how one calm, measured response had completely turned the tide. It became clear that people weren't just remembering what was said, they were remembering how it was said and how it made them feel. Asterisk in many ways. The moment was larger than just the two men on stage. It was a reminder of how leadership can be defined in small, decisive instances rather than long speeches or drawn-out battles. Obama had reminded people that composure is its own form of power, and that sometimes the most effective way to respond to hostility is not with anger, but with control. The lesson wasn't only for politics, it was something anyone could recognize in their own lives. Asterisk by the time the night was over, the story had already taken on a life of its own. Trump had sought to dominate, but Obama had taken the encounter and transformed it into a showcase of patience, wit, and mastery of the moment. The insult was forgettable. The sentence was unforgettable. And that was the true outcome. It wasn't about who spoke the longest or who shouted the loudest. It was about who understood the value of words and the silence around them. On that night, Obama reminded everyone watching that sometimes one sentence is enough to change everything. Would you like me to now? We've all 5 parts keynotes, plus ending into a single flowing story so you can use it as a